Relationship between theology and the way we practice Christianity. I believe that rather than taking Christians away from their more important tasks, what theology does is it empowers Christians to do those essential tasks and to do them well. The functions of the church are theological functions. The functions of the church are theological functions. Let me give you a couple of illustrations, but first, let me tell you a little story. In the early days of teaching this course, I had what I thought was a very powerful illustration. It was a bit provocative, but in those days I loved being shocking, so I thought it was nice to... I really actually thought that education occurs when you bring people into a room, blow up their views, and then build a new foundation. What I realized, and the story I'm about to tell you helped me to realize, is that probably isn't the most effective way to teach. So on the first day of class, I would come in, and after going over the syllabus, I would ask this question. I'd say, what is evangelism? And it happened every single time without exception. There would be multiple answers to the question. There would be multiple contradictory answers to the question. And people would start to yell at each other over evangelism. If it didn't happen with evangelism, I would ask, what is the gospel? And the room would explode. I actually have a lecture in ST 104, which is called, What is the Gospel? I don't ask the question, I answer the question. But I do it really late in the course, not at the beginning. It was very effective. It demonstrated that these very important issues are issues that there's difference of opinion about, and there's disagreement, and strongly held views on what evangelism is and how to do it and what the gospel is. And then I would argue that we need to actually have a theological conversation about that. We need to talk about this. A student came to me at graduation and said, you know, I took you for ST 101. I said, yeah, I remember, you sat right down here in the front row. And he said, I got to tell you, it took me a long time to learn to trust you. I said, why? He said, because of what you did on the first day of class. I said, what did I do? He said, when you threw out that question and you blew up the class. I said, I didn't do that. The students did that. He said, but you raised the question. And I realized he was right, that I had done it intentionally, trying to create tension and conflict. There are some illustrations that are way too good. We can't use them. I will give you more of those over the course of this semester. If you take other courses with me, I'll give you examples too, because I want you to learn from my mistakes. And I also want to warn you where some of the boundaries and dangers are. And I'm still learning that. I make up illustrations on the spur of the moment. Sometimes I have illustrations that I use every day. I have other illustrations I make up on the spur of the moment. Sometimes they work, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes they're way too good and I can't ever use them again. And sometimes they work so effectively, I try to remember, but I forget to use them again. So rather than asking the question and talking about it, this is a rhetorical question. So what is evangelism? Here's a definition. Evangelism is a presentation or proclamation of the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ to unbelievers. One of the things that always divided the class is whether evangelism requires words or not, and whether evangelism can be done of believers. A very large Protestant denomination actually believes that evangelism, you can evangelize believers. So those people would fight with, does it require words? So what is the gospel? What is the good news? And how should it be presented? What we present cannot be separated from the way we present it. That if you present the good news of the gospel and it sounds like bad news, what people are hearing is bad news. If we present the gospel by yelling and screaming at people, they're less inclined, especially my kids' generation, they're less inclined to listen because the presentation, the mode it doesn't match the the words. And finally, which is more important, the message or the method? If you answer that question, you're wrong. They're both important. I'm not going to fight. What about another very important work of the church, apologetics? What is apologetics? Apologetics, this is my definition, is the branch of Christianity that deals with the defense and establishment of the Christian faith. Christian apologetics is something every true believer should be involved in, even if it's only a little. And actually, it's in quotes because I borrowed it from somewhere else. Is apologetics directed to believers or unbelievers? I used to argue that apologetics is directed to unbelievers. I've changed my mind. I think apologetics is very effective to convince people who already believe what they already believe. Evangelism is directed toward non-believers, apologetics to believers. Clearly, it's a theological exercise. You might say, but discipleship is much more important than evangelism, especially for those who have believed. So what's a disciple? How does one make a disciple? We're commanded to make disciples. How does one do that? How do you make people follow? I thought God is the one who makes disciples. What's God's role? What is our role? When does discipleship begin? How do we measure it? When does it end? It's one of the challenges in discipleship, which we think we don't have in evangelism, because evangelism, you have ways of knowing when a person has satisfied the requirements of having been evangelized. When's discipleship end? Or worship. So what is worship? Can you imagine anything more oxymoronic than a proud Christian? The only thing that might be more oxymoronic than a proud Christian is Christians fighting worship wars. Those wars are not over. One of the reasons why Christians fight about worship is we don't know what worship means. If you really do understand what worship is, then it's not something we would fight about. The reason we fight worship wars is because we've equated worship with music. And when we talk about worship styles, then our personal preference comes into play. So you know that God doesn't like guitars and drums. You can never worship God with country music, rap. It has to be an organ, a choir. That's what I was taught. Actually, I grew up in a tradition where we didn't use instruments at all because instruments are worldly. That true worship happens in a cappella singing. All four parts with a hymnal. Love that style of music. But I also like rock music. I like guitars and drums. And I don't care where you have the lights. I don't care if there's smoke or not. Fake smoke, not actual. Most people, when they talk about worship, demonstrate they don't know what they're talking about. So I, again, in another course, have a whole lecture devoted to that question. It's very common today to talk about worship in terms of God's glory, but nobody really knows what that means. John Hannah, you can find it on the internet. John Hannah did a chapel message on the glory of God some time ago, and that was his opening volley. The glory of God is jargon today. Nobody knows what it means. And he spent the rest of his message defining what the glory of God is. It's the revelatory presence of God. The glory of God is God's presence. But the other jargon today is to make God famous. You know why we want to make God famous? Because if God is famous, then we're famous. It's that fascinating story in the Gospels where they tried to make Jesus famous, and he said, "You have to eat me." And I know eat me has a different connotation in our day than it did in his day, but I promise you, cannibalism, that was a shocking statement. They heard him say, "You have to eat my flesh." And everybody left, except Peter. "Are you going to leave too?" Jesus says. And Peter, in essence, says, "I would if I had anywhere to go, but I had nowhere to go, so I'll stay with you." He does say, "Because you alone have the words of life," which I think is a positive statement. How does a creature worship? Are there acceptable and unacceptable forms and functions of worship? There clearly are. There clearly are. And how's worship related to the culture, to the Bible, and to history? One of the things you learn pretty quickly as you study the practice of the church, that the practice of the church is always contextualized in a culture. Sometimes it's contextualized in a culture that no longer exists. Sometimes it's contextualized in a culture that is, and sometimes it's contextualized in a culture that is not yet, but it is always contextualized in a culture. These functions of the church are theological functions. And the questions we raise, the discussions we have, are theological questions and discussions. Theology helps us to learn how to practice Christianity well. We must stop driving a wedge between thinking and doing. We must stop driving a wedge between theology and practice and recognize that the practices of the church, the practices of Christianity, are theological practices, and that discussion about them and how to do them well, how to avoid doing them poorly, are theological conversations. I mentioned earlier that there are certain themes that recur over and over again. In fact, every stanza of this psalm expresses the psalmist's confidence in God's word. And then there are certain themes that are more episodic and periodic, that there are certain issues that the psalmist deals with only once or twice. This is one of those sections. And a section that is poignant. And because I think the psalmist, and I'm not saying he doesn't elsewhere tell the truth, but I think here he tells the truth in a way that I know he tells the truth in a way that makes some people uncomfortable. I actually heard a sermon on this text a couple of years ago, a sermon in which the preacher argued, it was a chapel message, in which the speaker argued that this is where David lost his faith. A, I'm not sure it was David. B, it's impossible to lose faith if we actually do believe in eternal security. And C, that interpretation is rooted in a lack of comfort, a lack of recognition of the reality of suffering and the way suffering people describe their pain. I grew up in a tradition where we were taught that suffering, pain is always a result of sin. If God seems silent and absent, guess who moved? It's always my fault. If bad things happen, it's always my fault. That law of karma is so deeply embedded in my tradition that whenever something goes wrong, I immediately think it's my fault. I think I've done something, and God is up there in heaven unhappy with me. When something goes well, exactly the opposite. I think, hey, it must have done something good. And then I'm also set up to think, so be ready for the other shoe to drop. Something bad is going to happen. That view of cause and effect, that view of karma, and I'm using karma in a non-technical sense, is so deeply embedded in me, and I think it's still deeply embedded in our culture, that it makes grace really hard for us to understand and grace really hard for us to accept. If you're happy and you know it, then your face should surely show it. There are people who have happy faces, and then there are people whose faces just simply don't show. I've had people actually say that. Is he ever happy? Because apparently I have a face that doesn't look like I'm happy even when I'm happy. I think the church ought to be a place where people can tell the truth. And I have not found it to be such. The church is a place where we put on a mask and act like everything's okay. You can actually test the community to see if they believe, if they care about you or not. If somebody asks, how are you doing? Tell them the truth, see what happens. I worked for a while in a church where a pastor he would say, how are you doing? And I'd tell him the truth. And one day he said to me, look, when I ask how you're doing, I don't care. I'm not asking for information. How are you doing is a way to say hi. I said, then why don't we just cut to the chase and just say hi? It'd be a whole lot quicker and simpler. That offended him. I have no idea why. Sometime later, I decided I was going to test him. And so he said, how are you doing? And I said, I've had a really tough week. My wife struggled at work, and I had to pay my car probably. And he said, great, glad to hear it, and walked away. I realized he actually was telling me the truth when he said, I don't care. My advice to you is that you look for a community of people who will tell you the truth and to whom you can tell the truth. Let's be people who care for one another at a much deeper level than simply, I know your name. And I think the psalmist here tells us the truth. He sounds to me like a man who understands suffering, a man who understands depression. I didn't until I saw what depression did to two people I cared deeply about. And then I realized when I saw what depression did to my wife particularly, that I realized that in an earlier period of time I had struggled. I should have known better because I had a counseling graduate who cared enough about me to say, I think you're depressed. And my response was, no, I'm not. No, not me. She actually was right. And this is not a constant struggle for me. I think I'm doing okay today. But I long to be one of those people who's a person to whom people can tell the truth. So if I ask you how you're doing and you're not doing okay, tell me. I've actually tried to practice not asking how you're doing because I don't want to use that question as a hi. I had a situation, I'll tell you the story. I had a situation a couple years ago where I was not doing okay, and I ran into a guy I really care about. And he said, how you doing? And I said, fine, and walked away. And you just lied to your friend. And so I went in and said, I just lied to you. I'm really not okay. And he didn't really know how to handle it. It was a little awkward. He didn't know what to say, which is perfectly fine. And he gave me a hug because he didn't know what to say. And that's kind of weird. But no. The psalmist says, I am laid low in the dust. How are you doing? Okay, under the circumstances. Then why do you live under the circumstances? As if I could do anything about it. Let's be people who tell the truth. I didn't say the whole truth and nothing but the truth, but let's be people who tell the truth. I'm laid low in the dust. And when he's laid low in the dust, he cries out to God, preserve my life according to your word. I gave an account of my ways, and you answered me. Teach me your decrees. Cause me to understand the way of your precepts, that I may meditate on your wonderful deeds. My soul is weary with sorrow. Strengthen me according to your word. I am laid low in the dust. My soul is weary with sorrow. And I think that verse 29 follows, because the time when we are most vulnerable to deceitfulness, the time when we are most vulnerable to sloppy thinking, the time we are most vulnerable to adopting karma is when we are low, when we are suffering. Keep me from deceitful ways, he says. Be gracious to me. and teach me your law. In the midst of my being laid low, in the midst of my sorrow, I have chosen the way of faithfulness. I have set my heart on your laws. I hold fast to your statutes, Lord. Do not let me be put to shame. I run in the path of your commands, for you have broadened my understanding. In times when serving God is challenging and difficult, in times when doing what we know we need to do takes every ounce of strength that we have, the psalmist reminds us that we keep on. Now this is not a pull yourself up by the bootstraps gospel. This is, if you need help, get help. There is a significant stigma still in the Christian church about mental illness, and that keeps people from looking for help, that keeps people from telling the truth. Let's change that. Let's actually be willing to say saving lives is more important than what people think. My daughter and my wife are alive today because of medication. I have a headache. Nobody cares if I take a Tylenol. But when my wife was struggling to be able to get out of bed in the morning, people cared whether she took Wellbutrin or not. She did it anyway and felt badly about it, felt guilty about it. It's a stigma that we have got to change. One of the reasons I'm proud to be at Dallas Seminary is because of our counseling program. It has changed the culture of this place. And I'm hoping it changes the culture of the Christian community too. What is theology? The transition now is actually to spend some time defining this word and several other words. One of the tasks in Prolegomena is to identify, to define the terminology that we are using, and then to talk about how to do theology. What is theology? Several definitions. Theology can be defined etymologically, that is, theology would be defined by the parts of the word. Theology is a compound word rooted in theos plus logos. Theos, God or gods, logos, words. So theology could be defined as words about God. Or more theologically, more technically, to be defined as the study of God. Because, again, as you know, any word that ends with ology is the study of biology, psychology, the study of life and the soul. Theology would be the study of God. But that's not very specific. That doesn't have a great deal of content. So one might define theology as the study of God and his work. So we're not studying just who God is, but we're studying who God is because of what he does. In short, we know who God is because of what he does. We know nothing about who God is apart from what he has revealed. We know nothing about God apart from what he has done. So it would be the study of God by studying his works, especially his works of creation and redemption. Or the word theology is used of a literary text. You read a couple of books with theology in the title. Exploring Christian Theology is a theology textbook. Alistair McGrath's Christian Theology is a theology book. So we refer to this work as a theology. Or we could define theology as a system or theory concerning the nature of God and his relationships to his works. Let me give you a couple of published definitions. The Pocket Dictionary of Theological Terms, a book, by the way, that I would recommend. When I came to Dallas Seminary out of Bible college, I thought I had left behind the time to use, because I had grown up beyond the value of dictionaries and encyclopedias. So the dictionaries and encyclopedias are for children. Once you get to graduate school, you no longer use dictionaries and encyclopedias. In my office, I have a set of books on the shelf right beside me. That's where the dictionaries and encyclopedias are. They're right where I can grab them, where I use them regularly. The Pocket Dictionary of Theological Terms, published by University Press, is a text that I would recommend. It's relatively inexpensive. It is small. It's called a pocket dictionary because it'll fit in your pocket if you have a large enough pocket. It's an inexpensive paperback, simple definitions of key terms. I use it regularly. It was edited by Grants and several other editors. This is a theology, the Pocket Dictionary says, is a religious belief system about God or ultimate reality. So both theists and non-theists would be theologians, like Ryrie argues that everyone is a theologian. Theology commonly refers to the ordered, systematic study or interpretation of the Christian faith and experience of God based on God's divine self-revelation. Theology also seeks to apply these truths to the full breadth of human experience and thought. So it's a religious belief system about God. It commonly refers to an ordered, systematic study or interpretation. It's not haphazard, it's not unintentional, but it's a systematic, ordered study of faith and experience of God based on God's divine self-revelation. Call your attention to the sick, which follows God's divine. When you quote a source, you quote the source exactly as the writer gave it. If there are grammatical errors, if there are spelling errors, if there are theological errors, you quote it word for word exactly like it was written. But if there is a spelling error or a grammatical error, you indicate to the grader, you indicate to your reader that you recognize the error. It's not your error, it's the author's error, by putting sick in brackets or parentheses afterwards. There is today, some people would argue for what is called a soft edit, where you would edit and fix I would encourage you not to do soft edits, because when you do a soft edit, you might misunderstand and misinterpret what the author actually intended. That's happened to me more than once, where I've written something and the editor has made changes which resulted in saying something other than what I intended to say. Sometimes the error was mine, and sometimes the error is there was no error. You just thought there was an error. So why would I put sick in that sentence? Because God's divine self-revelation is redundant. God, by definition, is divine. So if God is divine, God's divine self-revelation would be like a Rio Grande River. Rio means river. That would be a big river. Religious belief system about God is organized, it's structured based on God's revelation. It also seeks to apply these truths to human experience and thought. Alistair McGrath defines theology, even in the 5th edition, I checked, as discourse about God, as reflection upon the God whom Christians worship and adore. He is particularly here defining Christian theology. That Christian theology, he says, is a systematic study of the fundamental ideas of the Christian faith. Grenz and Olson define Christian theology as reflecting on and articulating the God-centered life and beliefs that Christians share as followers of Jesus Christ. And it's done that God might be glorified, and all Christians are and do. And you recognize several themes that are found in every one, similar ideas and expressions, but then there are differences. Grenz and Olson focus on the worship function, that God might be glorified in what we are and do. Here is what I'm calling a class definition of theology. Don't write this down. This is a definition that I inherited from Dr. Blazing, who was one of my teachers, who was the source of the notes that I started to use decades ago. What I did over the years was modify and tweak and change Dr. Blazing's definition. And here's what it became. several years ago, and then I'll tell you why I said don't write it down, although it should be fairly obvious once I show it to you. Theology is found in any conversation about God, but it especially denotes a study of the triune God in relation to human beings. This study is carried out in conjunction with some theory about God and his creation. The conclusion of this study is often presented in some form of verbal communication, and it always impacts the lifestyle of the theologian. Theology is any conversation about God, but especially, so any conversation about God that takes place in God's world would be theology. Even atheists have a theology, but particularly, especially it denotes a study of the God who is in relationship to human beings. We start somewhere. That theology doesn't start with a blank slate, but it's carried out in conjunction with some theory about God and his creation, and then the results are presented in words and lived out. The problem with this definition is that it's way too long. It took me years to figure that out. I'm sometimes not the smartest. It took me a long time to figure out that a definition that I can't remember is probably a definition that students won't remember. My first sabbatical, I taught this course and only this course in Atlanta. And probably because I was teaching this course and only this course, I was thinking a great deal about the subject matter. I showed this definition to the students and said, that's a terrible definition. It's true, it's good and helpful, but it's a terrible definition because nobody will remember it. So we took about an hour and we worked at shortening the definition. Here is the shortened class definition of Christian theology. This is one I think you can remember. Theology is any Christian theology is any Christian conversation about the triune God. Now, in this case, conversation is in quotes, not because I'm emphasizing it. If I wanted to emphasize it, I would use underline or bold or italics. It's in quotes because I want to call attention to a technical use of that term. I'm using conversation here, not in the common way the word conversation is used today. I'm using conversation here in a more archaic and old English sense for way of life. When I was a student in Bible college, I wrote a paper. I don't remember the text, but it was one of those texts where the Bible calls us to watch our conversation. So I wrote this great paper about how important it is to be careful about what we say, to watch our words because people are watching us. And I got a response from the prof. He gave me an A, which is the only thing that matters. But he wrote a little comment in the margin. He said, but conversation doesn't mean just what you say, it means what you do. I went up and talked to him about it. I said, so then why does the Bible that I'm using use the word conversation? He laughed and said, that's why you ought to get yourself a more modern translation. I said, why? He said, because language changes. And the more modern translations would translate, instead of conversation, in the King James, which you're using, they will translate it as a way of life. And I said, oh, so what should I buy? He said, you should buy the New American Standard. So I went down to the Christian bookstore and bought a paperback, I still have it, a copy of the New American Standard, because the Bible college I went to required one of two Bibles, King James, which I already had, or the New American Standard. I really tried to like the New American Standard. Could never pull it off. So I transitioned to a new King James instead of that. I was a rebel back then. I used the Bible that wasn't on the required list. And then I came here and picked up the NIV. Theology is any Christian conversation. It's not just what we say, but what we do about the triune God. You might say to me, but the triune God is redundant because the only God who is triune. Right. I'll grant you that. But in a day and age where in the Christian community, the Trinity is not really appreciated and valued, I think it's important that we who take the Trinity seriously emphasize that the God we believe is a God who is triune. He is not Jesus. He is Father, Son, and Spirit. Jesus is God, but God is not Jesus. The God who is triune. If you believe in a God who is not triune, I don't care how much you love Jesus, you're not a Christian. You're worshiping a God who doesn't exist. The Trinity really does matter. And since I've gone that far down the path, and what we sing about God ought to matter too, the way we pray about God matters too. We don't thank the Father for coming to earth and dying for our sins because he never did. Jesus did. Father is not a synonym for God. Father is the title for one of the persons of the Godhead. The other issue we argued about, I won the argument for triune God. The other one we argued about is whether we could replace the triune God with truth. It is a great deal to commend it, that theology really is the pursuit of truth. What we want to affirm is that which is true about God. And I could make the case that the God who is truth. And so theology would be true if it corresponds to the God who is truth. We didn't go that route because any definition of theology ought to have the word God in it somewhere. And so we settled on theology as any Christian conversation about the God who is. And the God who is triune. But I do think it's helpful to remind us that the God who is truth. And that the pursuit of knowledge about God is the pursuit of who God is the pursuit of truth. That, on the other hand, raises another whole set of questions. As important, as essential, as key, even though he meant it dismissively and disrespectfully, as key as President Clinton's "it all depends what is" was. There's a similar dismissive, perhaps, response, a similar dismissive, perhaps, rhetorical question. As Pilate asks Jesus, what is truth? Truth is a key component, a key term in theological education, and it is a term that needs to be defined. We're not going to do it today. We will come back and do it later. For now, truth has to be understood in relationship to the God who is truth. We are desperately in need of a definition of the term that works. Truth is one of those words that you never define a word by putting a qualifier in front of it. The problem today is that most discussions of truth are not discussions about truth, they are discussions about a particular kind of truth. So we talk about absolute truth and relative truth, and we need to step back and define truth before we can before we can put an adjective in front of it as if we know what we're talking about. Any Christian conversation about the triune God. Christian theology is theology done by Christians. This would be any Christian conversation about the triune God. Good definition? Short? Anything that's missing? Anything that ought to be in there? Anything you would take out? You can drop off the parentheses if you like. You could actually drop out triune if you like. You could drop out triune God and put Trinity instead. But any Christian conversation about the God who is wrestling with whether Christ died for all or only for some. We're still wrestling with this divine sovereignty and human responsibility. We're still wrestling with the problem of evil. But one of the questions that was a hot topic back then, we used to sit around and argue with one another. Which is more important, to teach people what to believe or how to believe? Or to teach what they believe or what they think or how to think? Should we teach people content, or do we teach them how to develop their own content? And I think the answer is yes. It becomes increasingly important in a rapidly changing world, which is why we'll spend as much time talking about theological method as we do. It becomes increasingly important in a rapidly changing world that we know not only what to believe, but how to communicate what we believe. to know not only what we believe, but how to apply what we believe in a variety of circumstances. We are raising questions today. We are wrestling with questions today that nobody ever wrestled before. You can pick up theology textbooks written prior to the 1990s, and you will not find any treatment of the internet. The first theology textbook that I'm aware of that actually has a section on theology and the internet was Alistair McGrath. And you pick up, John Calvin never said anything about the internet because Al Gore hadn't invented it yet. I know that's not completely fair because he didn't say that he invented it, but he took an awful lot of credit. There are questions, there are issues that theology has to address in 2015, in 2016, in 2017 that people weren't addressing in 1950s and 1960s. So what we believe is incredibly important. Why we believe it and how to think are also incredibly important. There are both components. There is both the doctrine, confessions, creeds, Bible teaching, and sermons, and the process or method of thinking and understanding and applying them to life. It's what Grenz and Olson describe as the critical and constructive task. It's what McGrath calls the scholastic and pietistic. It's what my teacher called the catechetical and developmental task. Catechetical theology is the activity of preaching, teaching, otherwise passing on the theology that has already been developed. This is handing down, as Jude puts it, the faith once for all delivered to the saints. This is the communication of a set of doctrine, belief that sermons and teaching moments and books pass on what that person or what the Christian tradition professes and believes. It's the passing on of an already developed theology, the communication of a doctrinal position. The developmental task is the activity of formulating doctrines, of constructing or reconstructing a theory of a theological system. It's the activity of development, the activity of change. It's the activity of addressing new concerns. It's the activity of not addressing other concerns. And maybe most importantly for us, it's the activity of finding ways to describe and explain what we believe differently than we did before. There are all kinds of illustrations that I could use of how language that meant one thing one time means something different today. And that if you use this language, you run the risk of A, not being understood, B, being a joke, and C, being really offensive. The way white people talk about black people has changed radically from the 1960s to the 21st century. Nobody thinks when you hear the word gay, nobody today thinks about somebody who wears brightly colored clothes, even though that's what the word means. That word has changed its meaning. And there are, some have argued that Christian is one of those words, that the word Christian no longer means anything. So they propose instead of calling ourselves Christians, let's call ourselves Christ followers. That's what Christian means. Developmental task assumes an already existing catechetical theology and the need to critique, reevaluate, reconstruct, reformulate that theology or some aspect of it, or the need to expand theological knowledge in some area or to address a new problem. So whether the developmental task is merely a change in language, whether the developmental task is to address a new concern, whether the theological developmental task is to apply in a different way, in a different context, the developmental task is essential. I think both the catechetical and developmental are necessary. They are both necessary. And I'm not arguing for a balance, 50% one and 50% of the other. They are both absolutely necessary. Where the church in America, in my opinion, is weak, and this is not merely my opinion, we are weak in the former. We have not catechized, we have not taught well. And I'm using that word even though I know for many people in the free church tradition, the word catechesis sounds too Catholic for them. It's teaching, it's communication. I grew up in a Sunday school class in the church. I grew up learning the Bible stories. Of course, nobody ever taught me how the stories fit together into the big story of the Bible. Nobody ever connected those stories for me, but I know the biblical stories. Kids growing up in the church today don't. I was preaching one time, and I referred to David and Goliath, and I said something like, you remember the story of David and Goliath. A guy came up to me afterwards and said, who's David? And where would I find that story of David and Goliath? That happened in the church. But a couple of months later, a very similar thing happened in Dallas Seminary classroom. And that was several decades ago. Just because it's familiar to me doesn't mean it's familiar to you. My practice when I'm thinking clearly, my practice is to say something like, you might remember, but even if you don't, I would go on and explain who David and Goliath were. We desperately need to train. We desperately need to teach. We desperately need to communicate. In my opinion, that's more than just reading somebody's book about the Bible. That the church desperately needs to train. We need to train our people in what the Scripture teaches. And we need to train them in how the stories of the Bible fit together. I learned the Bible stories, but the Bible stories were all about morality for me. The Bible stories all came down to be a good boy, obey your parents, or don't get caught. No, I mean, not unimportant. As the parent of 2 children, I wanted them to learn obedience. But the Bible stories the story of the flood is not about obey God or he'll kill you. Okay, there's so much more to that story. It's fascinating to think about how we tell that story to children. Things got really, really bad. Here's the way I learned it in Sunday school. That my teacher explained it like what happens when you're out playing in the dirt and mom makes you take a bath. That's what God did to the earth. He washed away all the dirt. Have you ever been in the presence of the aftermath of a flood? It's disgusting. It stinks. And if this was a worldwide flood, I think it was, there were all kinds of floating dead bodies, animals, humans. What a mess. It's a horrible story. Both catechetical and developmental are necessary. Both can be misused or misapplied. And the relationship between the two is hermeneutical, it's dialogical. It is both and, not either or. My goal in preaching, my goal in teaching is not to impress you with how much I know. My goal in preaching and teaching is both to communicate content and also to communicate methodology. Because that is so important to me, I will stop at times and warn against using an illustration I used. I will sometimes stop and explain why I do what I do, because I want there to be understanding of both the content and the process and the method. My goal in preaching is, as people listen to the sermon, I don't want them to say, ooh, he's really, really smart. That was a cool sermon. When they listen to my sermon, I want them to say, I can do that. I see that. I can do that. I can do that as well as he did, and you probably can. if you work at it as hard as I do, for as long as I have. My goal is to make it look easy. What is theology? Theology is any conversation about God. Christian theology would be any Christian conversation about God. What is biblical theology?